Hi everyone, my name is Altaf. I'm the chair of the branch and welcome to our talk where Dr. Omar Khalid from Facebook is talking to us. Dr. Omar gave this talk earlier on, I think, in the year and it was well received, very popular. So he's kindly sort of agreed to do this talk again. He's going to talk about managing complex product roadmaps across large engineering teams. It was like I said, it was a very interesting talk with being very interactive last time. So please, again, during this talk as well, if you do need to post your questions, just put it on the chat and Omar will sort of answer as he actually goes on. So a very quick introduction to Dr. Omar Khalid. He's an IT professional with a doctorate in computer science and 15 plus years of field experience leading technology organizations like CERN, which was a European organization for nuclear research. He was at Google Cloud, supporting its machine learning products deployment, and now at Facebook, which manages hundreds of petabytes of data every day, and he's a leading product owner. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to hand you over on to Omar. Thank you, Omar.
Thank you, Altaf, for the kind introduction. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, evening, or morning to you, depending where you are based. So as Altaf mentioned, today we'll be talking about how to manage and scale product roadmaps across large teams and organizations. I will begin with a bit of an introduction to a logging team, a solution we built at Facebook. So that set the context. And then we will use that as a basis to kind of go deeper into how that team grew, the challenges they had with their roadmap planning, and how we kind of matured that process over several years. So I gave that talk last year, I believe, and great to be back here. So let's get started. Okay, so Altaf already introduced myself, so I'm going to skip this. So today, as I mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about logging at Facebook. Then we'll go into roadmap management parts of the presentation. So let's have a look at the high level aspect of how logging is done currently at Facebook. So as you know, we have multiple consumer side products like Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram. They all generate different types of events, things like clicks, impressions. There are service events regarding the scale and the status of service. There's a lot of logs being generated, and of course, signals for machine learning. Those data points and events all have to be gathered, collected. They kind of originate in different regions globally. So we have to basically have a solution that is global, that is scalable, highly performant, and have low latency. So this is our kind of the logging solution there. On top of it, we have several real-time services built on it to do stream processing, indexing, things like that. And the data from the logging system flows into our warehouse for long-term storage, real-time applications, key value stores, and for aggregation purposes. So if you go a little bit deeper into this, just to break down how this data flow works and looks like. So we have this notion of a category, which is an abstraction through which all data is written, and then eventually a consumer reads data. If you're familiar with pub subsystems, probably you're familiar with things like topics. So it's very similar to that. So on the consumer side or writer side, we have a category which is a topic. The producer writes to that with a message payload. This is written to a local daemon. I will explain this a little bit later, how when we talk about the scale of this thing. The messages, this whole system is designed to fan out so that we can really scale it out globally. So the local agent collects that data. It actually buffers it in memory and both in disk, and then it publishes it to regional write services. They have the context regarding how to route that data, which region it should land, and then for the optimal data placement. The data flows to our write service and then lands into our storage tier, which we use. It's called Log Device. It's an open source product. You're welcome to have a look at it. It's very similar to Kafka, but developed at Facebook. If you look at logdevice.io, you will see all the details there. But this storage is only for transitionary purposes. Our data retention doesn't last more than a couple of days because it's primarily a logging system. So we don't want to retain data for long term, and also for policy and compliance reasons. So as data lands in retention service, it then is read by our read service, which could be globally located. There are instances of it running in different regions, and that read service basically then publish that data to the consumer. So they have a set of client APIs, they have client tools which they can plug into different applications, and then data essentially is forwarded to that consumer. Typically, our latency is around 200 to 300 milliseconds, and we can make that data available globally from one region to the other, because we do have a lot of dedicated network between our data centers, fiber connections, and undersea cables, and that provide us very fast data transport. Just to look at a little bit the scale of our system. So this is a little bit actually older data because we don't really publish always the latest stats because we have some constraints in terms of how we manage it, but this is the current status in some kind of, we can assume it. So currently, around 2.5 terabytes per second of data being written to our Scribe distributed logging solution, and around 7 terabytes of data is being read. You can see there's clearly an amplification. So in many places, data is written once, but then there are consumers which read the same data 2 times or 3 times or more, actually. This is actually the aggregated average. In some cases, it can be once, some cases could be hundreds of times the data being read. So this system is designed really to perform across different use cases. The piece of code, which is the Scribe daemon, it runs on millions of machines. We have hundreds of thousands of categories, which are topics, as I mentioned earlier, in the PubSub world. And it produces hundreds of petabytes of data, which then actually flows into our data warehouse for long-term storage, machine learning analysis, logging analysis, and things like that. Now, before I dive into the roadmap aspect of it, it'd be important to look at how we actually have structured our logging organization, because that actually will speak to the way we do the roadmap planning for the product. So for our technical, so we have a technical infrastructure organization where all teams are part of that organizational structure, and they provide different services. We have a logging org. That's where Scribe team is. We have the log device team there for storage side of things, ingestion for ingesting data from Scribe and database sources and into a warehouse. And then we have unstructured logging solution and data quality management. So sort of like, 4 to 5 teams in 2 different geographical zones, I would say. One is EMEA, another one is North America. So we have actually a distributed team, and when it comes to roadmap planning, we have to take into account the difference of time zones as well, and also in some ways a difference of culture, because that plays up into it. So, okay, so with that, let's dive into the roadmap planning side of things. So roadmap planning is an important topic for any product team. I've been with Facebook since 2018, and I joined at that time this organization. That's where actually we kicked off the roadmap planning process review, I would say, looking at how things were done before and how we began to actually optimize and improve it alongside it. So we went through different phases where we had initial adjustments made in 2018. We matured our framework in 2019, and then from 2020 onwards, as our organization grew from 2 teams to 5 teams, we actually were able to scale the roadmap process as well. So this might resonate with you in case if you work with distributed product teams in a which are part of the same organization. And we can talk a little bit about how these teams actually manages the dependency graph between them, how they cross-fertilize the ideas as they do the brainstorming process. Just one thing to note is that at Facebook, we do have long-term product vision, but our planning cycle tend to run for 6 months. So usually in a year, we will have 2 planning cycles, what we call 2 halves. So it will be H1 and H2. So actually, this is very timely because we are just going through the process of H2 roadmap planning for our organization. Cool. Okay. I don't see any questions so far. Feel free to ask any questions in the chat. I will keep an eye on that as well, and we can answer those as we go along. So let's talk about what problems we are trying to solve. Of course, that is building a roadmap, but it all started with Scribe team in 2018, as I mentioned earlier. So just as a recap, if this was to represent, let's say, the distribution of the service, but also that maps to Scribe team, so we have different team structure. We have a set of sub-teams that we call the right side of the team. They're responsible for taking care of all the services component, microservices, machine deployment for all the clients that actually are responsible for enabling our customers to write data. Then we have a team that is responsible for management of data storage, but also for the control plane. That's where the service discovery comes in, demand management, making sure that we don't overutilize our resources and we keep it check within the demand control parameters. And then we have a team that is responsible for the read side of the services, and then also being responsible for providing the right set of tooling to our consumer teams at Facebook. So this maps these 3 teams. Essentially, we have write plane, control plane, and read plane. So historically, how each team they did their roadmap planning back in 2018 was that when the time came for the kickoff the roadmap process, each team basically will do their own brainstorms. Write plane will do their own roadmap planning, control plane, and read plane as well. And this will generate set of project lists in each of these teams. We will take that list and we'll put that together essentially, and that will become the Scribe roadmap. Seems simpler, seem kind of, that the model used to work, but it had some challenges as well. So the key issue was that although being part of the same team, the sub-teams were basically kind of isolated in their pods. And when they were only brainstorming in the limited team boundaries, it kind of, in some ways, you can say, constrained the team's creativity, being able to provide ideas across team, since great ideas come from anywhere. So that was a challenge. And this kind of boundarization led for each pod to focus more on the operational aspect of the service rather than really thinking long-term. And this is because we were not from the outset looking at the roadmap from the long-term vision perspective. So I call this as a stage 1, state of things in our framework, where each team is sort of doing their own roadmap planning, and there's limited cross-team engagement. From this, we actually went from sub-team to the whole team, but that required a few changes. So first of all, what we did was, rather than brainstorming ideas based on the pods, we opted for ideation process to really look at what are the core themes, what we really care about, things like, and then we did surface analysis with the team, things like efficiency, reliability, better engineering, efficiency that came up as kind of main key pillars. Privacy and security, of course, another one. And this required basically for us to rethink, okay, well, how do we actually position these ideas? They're grouped in these themes and then enable people to provide contributions. So we took those themes and then we organized our roadmap sessions focusing on those themes. And that was very open. So rather than doing within the pod, we actually invited everyone in the team, which is like 35 plus people now. And that enabled us for everyone to contribute ideas, focusing on themes. So we will go sequentially, looking at different set of themes one by one. And that enable us to kind of have a list of projects which are more kind of integrated. They're more holistic. It looks at solving problems at the team scale rather than at the sub-team scale. And this actually was very well received because now all the engineers participated across all sessions. So this enabled us actually to start pivoting out of our tactical focus of the roadmap and also start shifting a little bit towards the strategic angle. It increased engagement and also the ownership because now everybody kind of have the space and openness to contribute ideas and knowing that their ideas are actually being part of the whole team's roadmap. They might not be working on it, but somebody else might take it up, but actually they have that now space. And that was very transparent. At Facebook, we have a bottoms up culture, which is kind of core part of the way we organize ourselves, the way we organize, and we really empower our engineers. So that was an important shift we want to make so that our roadmap planning cycle process reflects that. So I call this as stage 2, where we sort of dissolve the team boundaries and we begin to start focusing on team level goals and shift from tactical to strategical. So this is stage 2. So once stage 2 have been achieved, we are kind of now, coming to 2019. It's been like a year. We've been in that process, and we want to kind of continue maturing that process as well. So first thing, when we went to the next phase or stage was that since we have now already began to look at our roadmap ideas as the whole team, the important thing was to shift from doing half planning, but also having something as a long-term vision that will sort of like would act as our North Star, so that when we do actually do our theme-based analysis of the roadmap brainstorm ideas, we actually can still say and focus on like what is the direction where we're heading. So we use that actually as a basis to do our ideation. Another important change we made was that previous cycle, we learned that actually, if you do ideation just right before when you want to launch your roadmap planning process, it can actually somewhat skew the time available to the team because creative ideas don't necessarily come in that time frame only, right? So let's say if the cycle is from January to June, what if somebody have a great idea in February or March? That might be too late to be added in that cycle's roadmap. So we wanted to have a way where we can enable people to kind of contribute ideas early. So what we did, when we kind of closes one quarter within the half, at the beginning of that second quarter, which would be, let's say, Q2 for H1, and that will be Q4 for H2, we will actually open up the ideation phase. And this could be done if you use Workplace or you have Google Sheets. Tool doesn't really matter here. What matters is that we enable folks to start posting ideas. And that actually allows other people to have a look at what ideas are already being added, avoid duplication, and also to have discussion on it. And because we use actually Workplace internally, this allows us to have actual more deeper, meaningful discussions on ideas being posted. So we have like a template where somebody who have an idea, they will post that idea and they will focus on why, what value that idea will bring, what will be the impact of it, rather than thinking and focusing on the solution. Solution design could come later, and we want to avoid solution designing at early stage. And they will specifically say the tag, which theme this idea belongs to and what's the target half for the idea. We will take those set of ideas, consolidate them, and then we'll have a brainstorm summit, which is focusing on all themes. In the pre-COVID times, we used to run it in one day. In the COVID time, of course, we have to make changes. We cannot be in one room. And that model worked very well when we did that in 2019 mid 2019. And we will have one day, we will take the whole team to because we have multiple sites, we will take a team either to a different office, a different building. The main thing is to come out of your day-to-day space and think really creatively when you are brainstorming. And then post brainstorm, we will actually define certain phases alongside those pillars where we have specific owners and facilitators to help, through which the process will flow. And that provided a bit more structure. So rather than just taking the ideas from all the teams, we now actually can mature it and then take those ideas on in a set targeted way so that we can really develop them. So this is just a snapshot of our sugar-fueled, as I like to call it, roadmap summits. So this was a whole team. We will just spend the whole day in a room. The room had like a massive whiteboard. As we kind of focus on each theme, people will basically, we will have initial kind of ideation phase where people will take a post-it note, post it on the wall, and the discussion will kick off. And then the main important thing is actually when these ideas are put there, either in the workplace group or on the wall, we give a chance to everyone to speak to their idea. And we invite everyone to speak for a minute or so, and then others can basically have a discussion on that, still avoiding the solution design aspect of it. And this makes the process very inclusive because that means everybody can influence the priority roadmap. They might not work on it, as I mentioned earlier, but they can really contribute those ideas if they have it. Of course, we have lots of donors to kind of make sure the energy levels are topped up during the sessions. So now let's have a look at the process from the staging perspective. So as I mentioned, we kind of define these different phases. So I like to call it as 5-phase approach. And typically it will take around 5 to 6 weeks. So the first week, when we kick off, let's say a workplace group or the ideation phase, this is our kickoff phase essentially. The whole team is aware now because our teams have gone through this cycle multiple times. They're actually very aware of that. And this have actually brought a shift in culture as well over time, which is fascinating. I can talk a little bit about it if there is interest to that. Then once we have closed our ideation phase, we take in the ideas, we go through our roadmap brainstorm summits. And this typically after ideation can take 2 to 4 weeks. We do our brainstorm. And once we do the brainstorm, we try different approaches. As I mentioned earlier, we tried one day, we tried multi-day as well. And after several experiences of running these roadmap sessions, we noticed actually the one-day model worked very well if you are all in a physical room. But actually now given we are doing all virtual over Zoom or whatever meeting tool you use, that can be quite intense actually to do it, given everyone is remote. So we have now opted to do it multiple sessions across that week, but still for each session focusing on a particular theme. And that way, at the end of phase 3, we have essentially a set of project ideas, which phase input into phase 3 when we kick off our review and filtering sessions. This again run for 1 to 2 weeks. Again, where we basically take the list of all the ideas posted or added in a given theme, and they are then migrated to a Google Sheet, a tab in a Google Sheet. Let's say if you use Excel, it could be Excel. And then we look at the list across. And this time in this phase, all the team members are involved. Let's say if you have a team of 30 people, all 30 members are involved. From this phase onward, we begin to kind of reduce the number of people because we don't want to make it too taxing on time as well. So usually it will be the PMs and the engineering managers and the TLs plus the vertical owners. They will participate in these discussions. And the key focus of these discussions is that, again, as I mentioned, our culture is bottoms up. So we are very much consensus-driven organization. So what we do is, like, when we have these discussions, essentially we're trying to define priorities for our roadmap projects. And we have played with different models of prioritization. Some teams use the t-shirt sizes. We eventually found out actually the t-shirt size is not specific enough to kind of give you that clarity around like, okay, well, how do you distinguish something which is really critical from important from something that can wait? So we kind of ended up in using what we call this three-tier model, where we say, hey, P0 is our something super critical. If we don't do this, things will break. P1, which is our important part of our roadmap, but dependent on the team's available bandwidth. And P2, something nice to have, but can wait till next half. So it's kind of our future. So it becomes our backlog. Essentially, our P0 and P1 is our roadmap for that particular team. And then P2 is our backlog. So once we have done that, then we forward that list to each sub-team, and they can actually begin to start taking ownership of those project ideas. So as you can see, we started from themes, ideas posted by everyone. And as we prioritize, then we begin to kind of, as a funnel, start zooming in and start allocating both the pods, and eventually start inviting everyone to express interest. And then each pod can actually allocate those projects to specific suites or Ps. Once that is done, then we move on to a phase where basically we kind of start consolidating and we start preparing on our external facing. So if you work with external customers, that's the time you will probably prepare an external facing roadmap. We use the same terminology internally within Facebook, where all the partner teams we work with, they are our customers. So we actually prepare an external facing roadmap document. They have access to the complete list of things, but we just try to make sure that we tell a better story, because sometimes the level of detail in these spreadsheets can be could be a lot more and could be less interesting for the partner teams. So having a simplified version which tells the wins and the impact of that piece of work is actually a lot more useful than just a list of projects. So once we do that, then at the end of the process, we prepare it and we publish. And that's at that stage where we actually bring in our leadership team, and then we do reviews with them that what's our plan for next half. So with this, then we kind of close off our roadmap planning cycle. So if you look at then the maturity stage, we call this as stage 3 level of maturity, where now the team start early. They do brainstorm based on these themes. They spend almost like 5 to 6 weeks. It is the wall time, right? It's not a 5 to 6 week of consistent everyday time spent on it. In typical, if you look at it, it takes like 2 to 3 days of time for all of the actual planning work. But these 2 to 3 days of work is spread across 5 to 6 weeks. That makes the process a bit longer, but provides more time for discussion, provides more time for context analysis, fully understanding the scope of things, and building that consensus. So as a result of it, the phase approach works very well, because then it have milestones to deliver every week, and it progresses. The more important thing in this stage is that actually everyone have a key role and responsibility. And it's defined actually in our internal documents and templates. We define what's expected for engineer, for a PM, for engineering manager, and TL, and vertical owner in that process. And that actually is very helpful. That means everyone, as new members of team come in, and old members, some of them, they change teams or they go to the other locations, we maintain that common knowledge rather than retraining everyone every half. That also actually help for scaling the team itself from norming to forming stage. Cool, okay. I see there are a bunch of questions here. So let's see. There's a question from Ian. How do you deal with projects that don't really make sense without project from other sub-teams? Is sub-team membership flexible depending on P0, P1, load for each team? So that's a good question. So let's take the first one. So in the previous phase, if I go back here, when we're doing the review, actually, we really have deeper discussion around what is really P0. Over multiple years, we noticed initially people will call everything as P0, and there were less P2s. But over time, we begin to become more ruthless around calling out what is really critical and what is not actually critical. That's one. In our process, when we are doing this discussion, we do actually use, if I can go a little bit detail here, what we call a scope clarity. So before we actually give a priority to a project, we really kind of ask this question: is the scope for this actually clear? And that kind of alludes to this point that does this project make sense? If it doesn't, if it's just a greenfield idea, nice to have, but even actually not clear how we go about doing it, we mark it as scope unclear. And that actually helps us to filter out some of these initial ideas, which doesn't really make sense. If there is an aspect regarding other teams who want to contribute to this, we also actually open up a process. We usually publish a survey asking our partner and customer teams to also send out their requests and suggestions. So we have key team POCs who actually interact with their partner teams, largest customers, and they take in their requests early on. So we make sure actually those asks are actually tackled early on. Second part of the question was, is sub-team membership flexible depending on P0 load? Not really, because we have a management structure across these sub-teams. And the idea is not actually that where somebody posts an idea, they have to work on it, right? It's an idea based on that they think that is an area of investment, because at a larger team scale, like 30, 35 people, we usually have the same, what we call tier 1 on-call. Everybody participate into that. So they have context around, for example, somebody from right side of things, when they're the on-call, they might see issues on read side of things of the product. So when the planning stage kicks in, they can actually contribute ideas for the read. So then it's actually up to the read team in a way to prioritize and filter through, and it's kind of done as a group. So that enables. If people want to actually change teams, we do have a process for that. Typically, we expect people to stay in a pod for a year, and then they can switch pods. So that works very well as well. So in that way, they don't have to post ideas just to work on. It's just so that's something that makes sense. I hope, Ian, that was clear to your questions. Then there is a second question from Andrew. Do requirements not arrive from other parts of the organization? I think I kind of covered as a sub comment earlier that we do actually run surveys. We do actually interact with PSCs. So to make sure that we do take in. Over time, actually, what we have done is we now use workplace group. Our workplace groups are open. So it's permanently actually open. So when people post ideas, both internal and external customers, external means outside of the team, they actually see what ideas being posted, so they can post it. So we will take those in the intake process just to make sure that we don't exclude, because it's important to take customers' input as well. And second part of the question was, are they also collected at the ideation phase? Yes. Don't your leadership team sometimes just tell you what to do? That usually is, I could understand kind of the tendency. Unless it's a super critical kind of product or a new launch, maybe I would say, but generally our organizational structure is designed in a way, it's more flat and it's more bottom up, and it's about empowering engineers because they understand the context. From the leadership side of things, usually leadership kind of provide top level guidance, right? So for example, if I'm a CEO, there might be top level guidance. Hey, these are our key top priority areas. So one example could be, focusing more on privacy of the data, or security of that data. And then it's actually really up to each organization, pro team, to process that, look at it, how they can actually improve it. We do have, if I don't go down bit, then the CEO level, let's say our organization have a director, then we have a VP, sort of our sub-organization level. Those VPs, what they do is they tend to have their own priorities, which provide guidance that like next half, we want to focus more on shared infrastructure side of things versus, maybe perhaps analytics aspect. We want to improve that. Or maybe it could be, again, focusing on better engineering of the product, because you might have seen some reliability issues in the last half. So again, that is from the guidance perspective, not specific items that our team will work. So it's very, very rare, actually, our leadership team will tell exactly that what a sub team should be doing. And generally, if a leadership team organization does it, people will challenge it, because we have that open culture. People will actually ask, because we are data driven. So we like to kind of have these asks backed up by data. So I would say that it is more bottom up, but we have ways where we make sure that if there are specific direction from leadership, we take it. Cool. I hope that answered your questions, Andrew. So there's a question from Ian. How do you decide which SOP, standard operating procedure, to achieve efficiency? I'm not really sure what efficiency means here, but thinking a little bit about the SOPs, we try to reduce our processes. I'm going to kind of translate SOPs into kind of the number of processes we have. This whole roadmap process, all this phased, the steps are minimalist, because we don't want to increase the time tax on people. This is just to make sure that our core energy still focuses on actually producing, building products and executing on the roadmap. So we always question if there is a procedure, if it's really needed. If it's needed, then we will induct it. Otherwise, we will probably change it and make it optional. Cool. I hope that answered your question, Ian. So I'm going to move forward to the next part of the presentation. And if there are more questions, I will come back to those in 10 to 15 minutes. Cool. All right, so we were at the stage 3. So once we have done actually stage 3, it actually enabled us to kind of induct new processes. So once you have actually these priorities and themes, we start actually tracking our progress across those projects once the roadmap kicks off. And we do it on 6 weekly basis. This have actually worked very well, because this have enabled us to change direction, repivot, reprioritize. Regarding, there was a question earlier from Andrew that I think from Ian, that what if there was project that didn't make sense. So actually, if a project which got, let's say, inducted and it didn't make sense, most likely we will cancel it at this stage. And we kind of improved that process, that actually you see no cancellations here, because even if it's canceled later, because the team have spent some time on it, that is wasted time, right? So we try to avoid that early on. Cool. Now let's take this whole process from a given team's perspective and scale it to the whole organization. So in 2020, as I mentioned, our organization grew from 2 teams to 5 teams. So we start scaling up the whole process, and it's like, hey, this would be great. But as we were going to launch this process, unfortunately, COVID-19 pandemic hit. We went into lockdown in pretty much everywhere. In UK, that started in March. And that's when we shifted to the remote work. And we really have to actually change our approach, because first of all, the tools we use in terms of collaboration, in terms of working on the code base, but also actually things like roadmap planning, which is heavily kind of geared towards people coming into a common space and brainstorming. And that is actually was an important part of the experience, right? Stepping out from your day-to-day job environment and going to a separate meeting room or a site and doing that planning. So from tooling wise, we have to change, and the way we changed was, we kind of start using Google Sheets more actually to collect those ideas. We use our portal for virtual meetings. So essentially, this was my setup where, on the day we will have all the ideas posted in the Google Sheet. Everybody connected to on their own portal. And this actually works very well, because it connects to WebEx, to Zoom, our internal workplace meetings as well. So this separation of screen allows you to look at people on a separate screen rather than switching and look at the ideas. Although most of the meeting tools now have hands feature to raise hands, to ask questions, but in a large discussion, when this is happening, let's say 30, 35 people which are there, if 5 people raise a hand at the same time, you kind of lose the sequencing of that. And so it's important to make sure just like everybody get a chance to speak, nobody jumps the queue. So we developed our own hands tool that actually, allows people to raise hand for a given topic, for a different topic, ask a question, and categorize it, and then being able to group them. And then, whoever is a moderator, they can see the sequence of it, and they will call out those people's name, and they will ask a question. So we have to actually use some clever techniques to kind of, shift from the physical room to virtual room space, but it worked. So we took the whole process, expanded it to 3 teams, actually 5 now. And we use the same model, and actually it worked very well. Each team basically have their own brainstorming sessions, their own ideation phase, their own set of meetings, because they have the separate TLs, the separate vertical owners. And that is fine because the kind of boundaries are around each team. And this actually leads to, but they all run in parallel. So they're kind of, parallel tracks running every week. As a PM, if I'm supporting all these organizations, could be hectic for me because now I have to kind of, check in across all these 3 teams. But this model, as I previously mentioned, is built around have more scalable around having specific roles and responsibilities for all stakeholders, right? That is the TLs, vertical owners, the engineers, and this actually makes it very scalable. Then essentially, because now all the teams start using the same process, we can begin to look at, okay, well, how the effort now is being distributed, right? So for a given team, if we had the VOK, the investment in modernization of the stack versus reliability or efficiency is this, then we can kind of look at another team. And from organizational leadership perspective, that was a question from Andrew, I think, regarding how do you kind of take in the input from leadership. The leadership actually, they provide guidance that, okay, well, this half, these are our themes where we want to focus. And in some ways, when we kind of consolidate our roadmap ideas, because we are tagging them in those themes, we can really kind of communicate that across the organization, this is our distribution. And that actually helps the leadership to understand, okay, how each team is prioritizing a given theme based on their specific needs and requirements. So this kind of connects both ways. Again, another team having that point of view, which was good. So at this stage, we kind of got to a point where, we took something over the 2 years, started with sub-team level, matured that to a team level, resolving and breaking team boundaries, shifting from tactical to strategical, going to a place where the whole team is thinking holistically their roadmap, more longer time frame for ideation, and spending 5 to 6 weeks in the quarter with the specific key roles and responsibilities defined, that once that actually framework is designed, you can really take it to an org where you can have X number of teams and it will scale, right? Probably will not scale with 1 PM, but probably there could be different PMs or TPMs working on that and supporting it. But all of that, those teams and organization can actually run and design their roadmap for the next half. And then eventually it leads to a place where these teams then begin to think about the multi-year vision. And this has actually enabled us as well. Once we actually applied this framework to all these teams, we started actually building our multi-year vision. We can say, hey, well, now how these core feature areas actually will require what functionality, because there is some interconnection. As I mentioned earlier, there is a flow of that data, and each team is providing a service in that flow. Now we can really begin to look at that, not only the collaboration, but connectivity and dependency graph. Cool. That brings me to the last few slides of the presentation, which is good because that will leave us probably 10 or so minutes for more questions and further discussion. Right, so let's talk about challenges and learning. So I would say the biggest one was, when we started almost 3 years ago, how do we shift from operational mindset to strategic outlook? And that was really hard because I noticed each team, when they were looking at their sub-team level ideas. Those ideas were very much driven based on the firefighting that was going on. And it was a struggle to really bring the team's perspective out. But although people had the desire that they want to do it, unless there's a framework, the way people come together and post ideas or, ideate, it's very hard. So the framework really helped us to really make that shift from operational to strategic. And then it also is key actually that for a team that to define long-term vision. But sometimes long-term vision, I would say, is catch-22 because or chicken and egg situation where you need to make improvement in the overall framework that provides a space for the vision to really kind of, begin to simmer and for ideas to come together and then enable to have that vision drafted. And it requires probably, a number of iterations. So it's kind of, iterative and incremental process, but it's very well connected. And once you have it, the team performance, clarity, direction of the product improves manifold. Second aspect and challenge we had was around different team cultures. And I mentioned our organization grew actually from 2 teams to 5 over the years in different geographical locations, regions. So each team actually have different culture in terms of how they do things. That is one challenge. So it have to be kind of harmonized. And this can actually play a role because that cultural differences can, play up in terms of how each team define their priorities. What is the level of maturity between vertical owners and TLs and engineers? Some teams are more established, some teams goes through phases where they have, let's say for whatever reason, more attrition, so they might have their cohort of people are newer rather than kind of more experienced and veterans in the team. And that leads to challenges how the team can actually think about the roadmap. But doing this requires change management, especially when it's being done remotely. As I mentioned, for us, the big pivot, shifting from multiple team to whole org, at the same time, shifting from physical room space to virtual. We spent quite a bit of time that required cultural change and management across these organizations, and then essentially adapting the approach because although I kind of shared the high level framework, but there are certain tweaks we had to do across each of those teams just to kind of adapt for their minor cultural preferences without changing. So the process itself is very agnostic to a given team, right? So if a team wants to do different things at a different time frame, they can do it. If they want to have a different formatting of certain things, they can do it. It doesn't really kind of create challenges because it's primarily focused on how people come together, ideate, and flow through that process. And then finally, time zone differences that needs to be managed. So with this, thank you very much for your attention and questions so far. So I'm happy to take more questions. I don't see any questions here on the chat thread. So perhaps if you want to take questions on the call, happy to do that.
Just asked people to unmute. Thank you for that, Omar. That was very interesting. How do you? I mean, obviously, with COVID, you had to again go into sort of virtual teams as such. Have you had challenges, or do you all have people within these teams that you deal with working from other countries as well? And what challenges would that bring, or has that brought? You're on mute.
All right, sorry. Yeah, I think it got muted earlier. There have been challenges. I think primarily, first of all, less from the process or situation was, but mainly because COVID have been very stressful for everyone. Everyone working from home, especially people who have young kids. That was a big shift. We also saw where people end up spending more time because now, previously you will go to an office and you will leave office and you have a certain time boundary. Now you are starting at your desk. You might be sitting in the same room or a different room. That actually meant that, work-life balance, which we pay attention to a lot, in Facebook got kind of stretched a bit more, but the company have been very generous and thoughtful in terms of making sure that we have the right level of holidays. We had lots of additional times being given off. Companies supported us to have the right level of tools, because in terms of, as I showed in the earlier, where we were using this portal. So Facebook developed this portal device, and it was shipped to every single employee to make sure people have the right environment to work with, taking meetings, especially participating in these discussions, and generally being mindful. That was one key. And earlier, as I mentioned, we had to make changes to our framework as well to shift to the remote side of things. I hope that answered your question, Altaf.
Yes, thank you. Anyone having any other questions for Omar? Well, I guess not, but again, thank you, Omar, for that interesting talk on the roadmaps, and certainly thank you everyone for attending. Please keep looking at our website and make note of our emails that do come along. We have another event on risk in July, I think on 12th of July. But certainly, if you've got more questions that you would like to ask, Omar has kindly put his contact details there, and you can reach out to him. And this meeting has been recorded, and shortly it will be posted to YouTube as well. I'm going to end this session, but again, thank you, Omar, and certainly to everyone who attended. Thank you very much.
Thank you.